Barron Trump's unforgettable act of kindness left the world speechless, a story of compassion and redemption. Barron Trump sat quietly in the back seat of his family's sleek black SUV, staring out the tinted window as the bustling streets of Washington, D.C. blurred by. Life had changed drastically since his father, Donald Trump, left the White House, but Barron had always tried to keep a low profile. Despite being part of one of the most famous families in the world, he preferred solitude over the spotlight. Today, however, was different. He was on his way to a private charity event when something caught his eye: a disheveled figure sitting on the curb, clutching a cardboard sign. Barron's gaze lingered on the person, and a wave of recognition washed over him. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? No, it couldn't. But the closer the SUV got, the clearer the image became. The woman sitting on the cold pavement, her hair graying and her clothes worn thin, was someone Barron could never forget. Mrs. Greenwood, his former middle school teacher. She had been one of the few educators who truly believed in him, often encouraging him during his most challenging moments. "Stop the car," Barron blurted out, leaning forward. His security detail exchanged glances, unsure of his sudden demand. "Mr. Trump, is everything all right?" asked the driver, slowing down cautiously. "Yes, just stop here," Barron insisted, his tone firm. As the vehicle came to a halt, Barron stepped out, his tall frame towering over the scene. The cold winter air bit at his face, but he didn't care. He walked toward Mrs. Greenwood, who was too busy scribbling something on her sign to notice him at first. "Mrs. Greenwood?" Barron's voice was gentle but filled with disbelief. The woman looked up, her tired eyes widening in shock. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. But then, her expression softened, and tears welled up in her eyes. "Barron?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" Barron nodded, kneeling down to meet her at eye level. "It's me. What happened? Why are you here?" Mrs. Greenwood hesitated, shame coloring her cheeks. "Life hasn't been kind since the school shut down. I lost my job, my home, everything." She paused, her voice breaking. "I didn't want anyone to see me like this, especially not you." Barron felt a lump form in his throat. Memories of her warm smile and unwavering support flooded his mind. This woman had once been a beacon of hope for him, and now she was living on the streets. "You don't deserve this," Barron said softly. "You helped so many people, including me. Let me help you now." Mrs. Greenwood shook her head, wiping away tears. "I can't let you do that. I've always believed in earning my own way." But Barron wouldn't take no for an answer. "You've done more for me than I could ever repay. Please, let me do this." As onlookers began to gather, Barron pulled out his phone and made a call. The wheels of change were already in motion, but little did Mrs. Greenwood know. This was just the beginning of a life-changing moment. Barron Trump wasn't one to wait when action was needed. As he finished the call, he turned back to Mrs. Greenwood, who still sat on the cold pavement, her hands trembling. The small crowd that had formed around them murmured in curiosity, but Barron didn't pay them any attention. His focus remained on the woman who had once inspired him to believe in himself. "Help is on the way," he said with quiet determination. Mrs. Greenwood opened her mouth to protest, but Barron gently held up his hand to stop her. "Please let me do this. You deserve so much better than this." Minutes later, a sleek black SUV, identical to the one Barron had arrived in, pulled up to the curb. From it emerged a woman in professional attire, carrying a clipboard, and a man in a suit with a warm, reassuring smile. "Mr. Trump, we're ready," the woman said. "Mrs. Greenwood," Barron began, crouching down to her level again. "This is Jennifer. She works with one of the best housing assistance programs in the city. She's going to make sure you have a place to stay tonight, and then we'll work on something permanent." Jennifer extended a hand to Mrs. Greenwood, who hesitated, her pride and years of independence holding her back. "It's okay," Jennifer said kindly. "We're here to help, no strings attached." Tears began to flow freely down Mrs. Greenwood's face as she took Jennifer's hand and slowly got to her feet. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough." Barron shook his head. "You don't need to say anything. Just promise me you'll let them help." As Jennifer led Mrs. Greenwood toward the SUV, Barron wasn't finished. He turned to the suited man, who handed him an envelope. "And this," Barron said, placing the envelope in Mrs. Greenwood's hands, "is something to get you back on your feet. It's not charity. It's a thank you for everything you've done for me and so many others." Mrs. Greenwood opened the envelope with trembling fingers and gasped when she saw the amount written on the check. "Barron, this is too much." "It's not enough," Barron replied sincerely. "You gave me confidence when I needed it most. You gave so much to your students. Now it's your turn to receive." The crowd around them, once skeptical and curious, erupted into applause. People whispered in awe about the young man's humility and generosity. Barron, uncomfortable with the attention, simply nodded and turned back to Mrs. Greenwood. "You'll be okay now," he said softly, "but this is just the start." Mrs. Greenwood smiled through her tears, her heart full of gratitude and disbelief. She couldn't have imagined this morning that her life would take such a dramatic turn. But deep down, she wasn't surprised by Barron's kindness. It was a testament to the values she had tried to instill in him years ago. As Mrs. Greenwood was taken to her temporary housing by the team Barron had arranged, he began working behind the scenes to make her recovery permanent. He wasn't satisfied with just providing a short-term solution. He wanted to rebuild her life in a way that would restore her dignity and security. Barron immediately got on the phone with some of his most trusted contacts. His father, Donald Trump, had always told him to surround himself with people who could get things done, and Barron knew exactly who to call. He reached out to influential individuals in the education and nonprofit sectors, explaining Mrs. Greenwood's situation and how she had dedicated her life to teaching and shaping young minds. Within hours, Barron had secured several offers of support. One organization agreed to pay off Mrs. Greenwood's medical debt, which had been a major factor in her financial downfall. Another offered her a part-time position as an educational consultant, allowing her to slowly re-enter the workforce in a way that respected her health and limitations. But Barron didn't stop there. He knew that Mrs. Greenwood needed more than financial help. She needed a support system. He reached out to some of her former colleagues and students, many of whom were eager to reconnect and help in any way they could. One former student, now a successful entrepreneur, offered to provide ongoing mentorship to Mrs. Greenwood, ensuring that she had someone to guide her as she rebuilt her life. Meanwhile, Barron worked with Jennifer and her team to find a permanent housing solution for Mrs. Greenwood. They located a cozy apartment in a safe neighborhood, close to community resources and public transportation. Barron personally covered the deposit and first year's rent, ensuring that she wouldn't have to worry about finances as she got back on her feet. As the pieces began to fall into place, Barron felt a sense of accomplishment, but also humility. He knew that his actions were only a small repayment for the years of dedication Mrs. Greenwood had given to her students, himself included. She had been there for him during a pivotal time in his life, and now he was proud to be there for her when she needed it most. When Barron finally visited Mrs. Greenwood in her new apartment a week later, he was greeted with a warm hug and a home-cooked meal. The apartment was modest but filled with small touches of Mrs. Greenwood's personality: books on the shelves, photos of her students, and the piano he had gifted her through another anonymous donation. "You've given me my life back, Barron," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Barron smiled, his usual quiet demeanor softening even further. "You've already thanked me, Mrs. Greenwood. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. This is the least I could do." The bond between them, forged in a classroom years ago, had only grown stronger through this experience. For Barron, it was a reminder of the importance of compassion and using one's resources to make a difference. For Mrs. Greenwood, it was a testament to the power of kindness and the ripple effects it could have on the world. In the days that followed, news of Barron Trump's actions spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with posts praising his humility, kindness, and unwavering dedication to helping his former teacher. Videos of him delivering groceries and sitting at Mrs. Greenwood's bedside went viral, capturing the hearts of millions around the world. But for Barron, the praise didn't matter. He hadn't done it for attention or recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Still, the media frenzy brought an unexpected benefit. It sparked a nationwide conversation about supporting educators and addressing homelessness among those who had dedicated their lives to teaching. Organizations and philanthropists began reaching out, inspired by Barron's actions. Donations poured into educational charities, and several states announced new initiatives to support retired and struggling teachers. It seemed that Mrs. Greenwood's story had ignited a movement, and Barron quietly marveled at the impact one act of kindness could have. One day, as Barron was visiting Mrs. Greenwood in her apartment, she handed him a neatly wrapped package. "This is for you," she said, her eyes twinkling. Barron unwrapped it to find a framed photo of the two of them from years ago, taken at one of his school's award ceremonies. In the picture, Mrs. Greenwood had her arm around a young Barron, both of them smiling proudly. Below the photo, she had written a simple note. "Thank you for remembering me. You've given me more than I could ever repay." Barron felt a lump rise in his throat as he read the note. He placed the frame on her mantel and turned to her with a smile. "Mrs. Greenwood, you don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe you for everything you did for me and so many others. This is just a small way of saying thank you." As they sat down to share a cup of tea, Mrs. Greenwood said something that stayed with Barron long after. "You've reminded me of something I used to teach my students," she said. "One small act of kindness can change the world, even if it's just for one person." Barron nodded, knowing that her words were true. In helping Mrs. Greenwood, he had rediscovered a sense of purpose and humanity that often got lost in the noise of his family's high-profile life. And in turn, Mrs. Greenwood had found her strength and hope again, proving that kindness was a two-way street. From that day forward, Barron became an advocate for teachers and a quiet champion for those in need. He never sought the spotlight, but his actions continued to ripple through the lives of countless people, all sparked by a simple yet profound moment of compassion. For Mrs. Greenwood, the love and support she received became a foundation for her new life. She returned to teaching part-time, mentoring young students and reminding them of the value of kindness and perseverance. And every time she looked at the photo on her mantel, she felt a surge of gratitude for the student who had never forgotten her, even when the world seemed to have moved on. It was a story of hope, redemption, and the power of human connection, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single act of kindness could illuminate the path forward.